Now, I mentioned cable news, and I wanted to just get back to it for a second because I think it's important. It's a trend that's affecting what we're doing, but I think it's different in one way. Cable news did very well last year. In our content analysis of cable, we found that 63% of the airtime on the three main cable channels was devoted to the election. 63%. There was a lot of stuff they didn't cover and don't cover anymore. They largely cover about 4 stories a day and use wires for everything else. They became, in their own words, the place for politics, the best political team on television, et cetera, et cetera. And that's actually continued this year. They benefited from the fact that there was a very high interest in that election. It's also true, however, that they became, as a consequence, increasingly the medium on which our political discourse is played out. And the president, the new president, has talked a lot about the role of cable talkers and of Rush Limbaugh. I think their influence is, can't be dismissed, even though it was story specific. On that story, on that subject, I think cable has an elevated role now in the wake of 2008. And that has an effect because of two things. What we see in cable is the media really operating as an enabler, as a conduit, not as an institution that turns over rocks and explores things in a repertorial way. It is a conduit for talk. And they devote a lot of their time, hand over a lot of their time, even at the one channel, CNN, which tries to imagine itself as an even-handed broker among both sides. But basically, they're having spin doctors and political surrogates fill the time. It's not repertorial journalism or media. It's sort of the media as an enabler. The other thing that I think is important about cable is the judgments are minute to minute to minute. We literally saw, I hate when people say that, we saw in the first 2 weeks of Obama's presidency, people on cable talking about the prospect of a failed presidency within 2 weeks. The notion in this era of a honeymoon or 100 days seems really antiquated. And that relates to this other trend that I think we're seeing. As the traditional media shrinks because of these declining revenues, and by the way, by our counts, one out of every 5 newspaper reporters who was working in the United States in 2000 is now no longer there. That is what the count we came to at the end of 2008. Those cutbacks have probably increased since then somewhat. And I suspect that by the end of this year we may see perhaps a quarter of all the journalists who were working in newspapers at the beginning of this decade no longer there. You add to that the power of the sort of technology to make the media very fast, to make it speed-oriented. And I think what you have cumulatively is that even our repertorial press is becoming more reactive, more passive, more of a conduit. To give you just a couple of examples, in 1992, the Washington Post's David Miranis, one guy, did 13 major biographical profiles of the eventual winner of the race, Bill Clinton. In 2008, the Washington Post combined, all of its reporters, did 3 major biographical profiles of the eventual winner, Barack Obama. My old newspaper, the LA Times, did 1/3 as many enterprise pieces about the 2008 campaign as it did about the 1992 campaign, when, by the way, we sent 2 journalists to live in Little Rock, Arkansas for 18 months. They moved it to learn everything they could about the person that they thought might be the next president of the United States. That kind of enterprise and expense is not practical in the current environment of journalism. And what's significant about that is that what we're talking about when we talk about professional journalism shrinking is a shrinking of this repertorial part of the media. Because the discussion element of journalism, the part in which the public then reacts to new information, that is thriving. The new technology has made that more robust than it's ever been. So the public is debating, discussing, cogitating over the implications of the news far more than it was a decade ago. But the number of new facts and unexpected facts and facts that the news makers didn't control is shrinking. And I want to say one thing here about what this implies about where journalism is going and where it needs to be. The metaphor that we used for journalists in the 20th century was the journalist as gatekeeper. There's a famous quote from Walter Lippmann in a book called Liberty in the News, which I'm about to mangle, because I can't remember it exactly, in which he says that the role of the journalist is to sift through the rumor, the gossip, the innuendo, and the fact that flow through a newsroom. He didn't say that the journalist would then keep the rumor, the innuendo, and the gossip to themselves, talk about it in the bar that night, and be fine. But what he meant was that the journalist would let the facts out and keep the unreliable information in so that the public wasn't misled. It was a very romantic and notion of the press's role, and he called it in this book, which was before he became more cynical about prospects for the press, he called it one of the sacred and priestly roles in a democratic society. What it really meant was that if you, Sunshine, were the news maker, and you were the public, Sunshine had to go through you to reach her. You were the media, and there was no alternative. And you were the gatekeeper who decided, of all that spin that she was pushing, what you would let her know. This young lady, who I assume might be your wife. The marriage, or never? In today's world, you are only one way in which Sunshine, the newsmaker, can reach the public. There's Barack Obama's 13 million email addresses that he has of his own supporters. There's his websites. There's all these, there's talk radio. There's all these conduits. So the notion that the press is a gatekeeper and decides, I will tell you what you know. And if you read it here, you can believe it. And if you didn't read it here, you shouldn't believe it. That just doesn't work. Our metaphor is now obsolete. So what is the role, what is the metaphor that we should be thinking of for the journalist in this new century? Why do we even need journalists if we have these other sources? What good are they if they're just going to duplicate something that I can get for free from the government? Why should I go through your filter if I can just go to Barack's website or listen to Rush or any number of other things? This list, which I've concocted, is my listening to a lot of journalists. This is what I think professional journalists aspire to in this new century. The first one is to be an authenticator. To tell you, our surrogate member of the public, of all these things that I'm hearing from all these places, which ones are true? Which ones can I believe? In an environment where there's so much information, tell me what I can believe. How do I know what to trust? A second thing that journalists aspire to, and you can see this in the ever increasingly interpretive nature of what you're going to get from traditional outlets like the New York Times, is a sense maker. Help me make sense of all these things. When information is in oversupply, as it is today, knowledge is harder to create because you have to sift through more stuff to figure out what things